and everybody to the episode of How with Cristian Videla, Wharton MBA 2004 and Lauder 2004. Welcome, Cristian.
Thanks so much for having me. It's as we were discussing a little bit earlier, this is such a great series to be able to reconnect and have a little bit of a window into people's lives. So, thank you guys for actually doing this. I think it's a great initiative.
Thank you very much, and thanks so much for joining us at this very early hour for you. We appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's 7 a.m. in California, but hey, really happy to be part of this.
Cristian, we'd like to start with a little bit of an origin story. Tell us about how you grew up, what influenced you, and what ultimately led you to Wharton.
Sure. Hey, just a quick one, because I know this is on social media, and my lawyers had advised me to just say that I'm here as Cristian. I'm not here representing Amgen, so obviously my views are my own. So that's out there. But yeah, no, just getting to the story as you asked. So a little bit about myself. I think my career and my life have always been a bit of a global or a nomad experience. My father, he was a diplomat, so we used to travel a lot growing up. I'm I'm an Argentine national, I should say, but I was actually born in Belgium. And when I was 3, I actually went to Argentina to live for the first time. When I was 6, I actually moved to South Korea. When I was 9, I moved to France. When I was 13, I moved back to Argentina. When I was 16, I moved to Chile. And then when I was 18, I moved back to Argentina just for undergrad. And so, I think that was a bit of my formative, forming my normal, let's say, for my life, which was a little bit different. So, for me, when I graduated, it was normal to think, well, what's next? Where am I heading from here? So after, undergrad, which was actually in business, and then I had a master's in finance, I actually, first I started my career in banking. I worked for JP for a little bit. Quickly knew that was probably not for me, so I moved into actually management consulting. So I went to work for the Boston Consulting Group in Argentina. Had a ton of fun. I mean, this was the end of the end of the 90s. That's correct. I'm trying to get my years right here. So it was the beginning of, at least in Latin America, this was in Argentina, it was the beginning of the internet times. It was funny because I did a couple of projects helping large companies actually come up with their internet or digital strategies, which was kind of a big unknown at the time. And at the same time, what was curious was a lot of my colleagues were actually leaving to start their own companies. And in that short interim, in the space of 6-9 months, even one of my colleagues actually became a kind of a millionaire overnight with one of these things, right? So you would see all these stories. And the reason I'm bringing this all up is because after a year and being sort of an expert with from a consulting perspective, actually a colleague of mine, I would talk to colleagues and I would say, hey, it's incredible what's happening. And a colleague of mine told me, hey, you know what, we're thinking of actually leaving and starting a company. Would you be willing to come and join us? And it was interesting because, and the reason this is also particularly important for this conversation is that colleague of mine from BCG, who was a little bit senior to me, was actually a Wharton alum. He had done Wharton and Lauder as well, and he was joined by a couple of other Whartonites, and they actually decided to start this company. And so ultimately, I decided to join them. We were able to raise about $4 million in seed money, which was kind of considerable for that time, I guess, and for the region. And it was a really fun sort of year that we had. So we went from kind of the 3-4 of us to being present in 8 markets with about 120 people at some point. We had 5 portfolio companies because we basically said we want to have, we don't want to just do one thing. We want to eventually, I think our dream was to become a VC. Initially, we became a technology incubator. So we said we're going to start a couple of our companies. So we had 2 kind of homegrown companies, and then we had another 3 companies that came and joined us. so we had 5 companies, and the interesting thing out of all of this, which is no longer possible, I guess, at this point, is that we had 0 revenues. So everything that I mentioned was with 0 revenues. So it was like this fast-paced time where it was like we need to get people to get excited with our projects. We need continuous fund, right? So we would get funding periodically, and things were going relatively well. I think we were at one point, we had an offer from a VC to do a capital injection that would have, I always say I had my 2 weeks of paper millionaire, which obviously was completely illiquid. And actually it's not even formally paper millionaire, because my colleagues and I decided that it was probably not the right valuation. We were still kind of in this moment of the high. So I was 25, they were in their early 30s, but we were all kind of very bold and thought that things could go even better. And shortly after that was actually when the bubble burst, and it was time to start making kind of tough decisions. So again, this is kind of a long road. We had a CEO for the company that we had, for one of the companies that we had, which was a kind of student portal, and that person resigned. So for me, it was an opportunity to be the CEO of that company. Until then, I had been just the office manager for Argentina. So I was the CEO of this company, but again, it was like we had no funds, and we needed that capital injection. But unfortunately, in emerging markets, in the midst of this bubble burst, the VCs had all gone away. So the only option that we had was to partner with someone that somehow had gotten their hands on cash before things dried up. So I actually went up to Mexico, and long story short, I was there negotiating with them for quite a bit of time with a company that had received these funds. And I convinced the CEO that he should actually, we should join forces and make something that was regional rather than a company in Mexico. Unfortunately, the VCs said, "Hey, it's not your decision to make. It's our decision to make." And so that kind of ended that. But so I went back to kind of Brazil with kind of a little bit of a sad face, because we had to make again some tough decisions there. We kind of were able to close that company without too major pain, except for the disappointment that we weren't able to pull that through. And we kept one of the companies, which was actually a pharmacy benefits management company. And I had the opportunity to stay in that company, but I decided that given that the dynamic had changed, this was the company that was the least technological of them. It just felt like a traditional startup. I decided, hey, maybe I should just go back to consulting, and actually went back to BCG. And the other thing maybe to say is, I think that's the reason that I really got excited about Wharton, because I saw these people that I really liked. I liked the way that despite the fact that they had gone to a really good school, they were still super nice people, let's say. So they didn't have this kind of thing of, oh, I'm so important. I just came out of this, great school. And so I knew that I wanted to go back to business school, and hence going back to consulting felt like the right thing to do. So I stayed there for a little bit, and then eventually went to Wharton in 2002, which is incredible to think it was almost 20 years ago that we were starting our MBA. So that's a little bit about, I can share more, but that's a little bit of how I got there. I have to say, the other thing about me is, I always like to think, 5-10 years in advance, which is weird, but I've had that since I was relatively young. So when I graduated from undergrad, I already knew, hey, how do I build a story for my MBA? So it was like, how do I build the story to get in? So I was like, okay, it seems like management consulting is a thing. It seems like banking might be helpful. And I think when I actually was making the decision which seems really weird right now, but even the decision to go work in a startup was a little bit like, hey, that kind of is a good resume builder. So that was me then. We can talk about how that changed in time, but that was me then. And I had a great time at Wharton. I tried to make the most out of it. We can talk about that, or we can talk about something else, but I'll let you guys guide us.
No, that was an incredible story. I mean, it's just kind of crazy how it seems like almost from year to year, as a kid, you were growing up in different places, and then you started your career, and then kind of still bouncing around. I'm curious about the startup. I mean, did you always see yourself joining a startup, or do you feel that you kind of like were swept into it? Like, what was your thought process? Because I mean, you were a management consultant at a very top consulting, and it could be very easy to just stay. So what ultimately led you to decide, no, I'm going to try this out?
So it's funny, a little bit about, non-professional, and then I could get at the professional level. I think, from a non-professional perspective, I used to always define my life as, I don't know what life is about, but when I am in front of St. Peter, in line to be judged for my good or bad actions, I want to be the one that has the best stories to tell, right? To be able to say, I did really interesting things. And I used to always say, I don't want to be the person that says when everyone was jumping into startups and living that very unique experience, that I was the one that wasn't going to do that. I used to tell my friends, I don't know if I'm going to be able to face my grandchildren and tell them that in the middle of this, I decided not to be part of it. And it's funny because, recently I've been back to Argentina, and it's funny because it was such an interesting time. There were all these people just starting their companies, and there was this unique energy, which I'm sure exists in other pockets now. But if I think about, there's now the largest company in Argentina is a person that started Galperin, which started more or less at that time. A colleague of mine had actually started there were a couple of companies that were actually trying to build the eBay of Latin America. And both of these individuals are now very well off. I don't know exactly their net worth, at least. Well, one of them is a billionaire. The other one, I'm not sure of his net worth, but I'm sure he's pretty well off. And it was this unique time of actually people, doing these sorts of things, and it's incredible to see how they've been successful in time. But so it was really, I didn't really think it through. It was more like, this is such an interesting time, that I think it would be such a pity not to do this. And then, as I went through it, it's interesting. I think a lot of the the leadership traits that I have today came from then, right? You learn how to motivate people. So, for example, I remember, I was talking about the difficult times when I actually went to Mexico, and I remember a meeting where I had to tell people that were working with me, hey, we're running out of money. So, you guys have two options. You can resign now, and I will understand. Or you guys can stay on, and we fight the fight together, and this is our project. And it was really interesting to see that people decided to stay. People wanted to stay. People wanted to see the project go through. And the leadership learning for me at that point was really how important it is to have a purpose in what you do, how important it is to have that kind of common vision of where you want to go, and how that is ultimately the biggest motivator. It's not about, obviously, we all want to have a purpose in what we do, and a startup kind of brings the best of those elements. So I think it was the right decision. One could think about it as, hey, maybe I just kind of lost a year there of my life, but I think it was many years gained early on in terms of experience, and it was just so fast. It was just so fast. So yeah, that was an interesting time.
And what did you decide to do after Wharton?
So after Wharton, it's interesting. So I've always had an interest in biology and genetics, and I said, is there any way that I could actually find a way to combine kind of my interest with business and science and innovation and so forth. So I knew that at some point I would want to go into healthcare. But I didn't want to go straight on. I said, maybe what I'll do is I'll go back to consulting. I'll try to accelerate my learning in the industry, and then I will go into the industry and know a little bit better in what sort of role and geography and company I want to go work for. So I did that. And the other thing is I said, Wharton opens the doors to do things, to new markets, new opportunities. So rather than go back to Latin America, I was working with BCG in Brazil. I started to look for opportunities either in the US or Europe. And I was fortunate to get, BCG was a little bit tricky to kind of move around with, but, I was able to move with McKinsey to work in their one of their hubs that actually does most of the pharma work, which is in Brussels. And although I was based in Brussels, I spent very little time in Brussels. I remember at some point considering, should I even have an apartment or should I live in a hotel? But I think I couldn't make that mental leap of not having a place where I had furniture. So I kept my apartment, even though I sometimes spent maybe a week, a year at the very beginning. So, but so the 5.5 years or so that I spent at McKinsey, I probably spent a year in the UK, maybe a year in Spain. 6 to 9 months in France and Italy and Germany, worked in Greece and in Japan, so in a bunch of different places, which again was very, I think the reason I left McKinsey is not only because my again my 5-year plan was to do something else at some point, but it was also just this notion of, at first I really enjoyed this thing where you don't know what's going to happen in 3 months. You have that kind of energy from saying, I'm going to do this experience. It's going to be super intense and interesting. And in 3 months, I'm going to be in a different country, working in a different function, potentially in a different company. Now, obviously, you fast forward a few years, and suddenly you're thinking, I'm not married. I don't have any kids. I'm 35 years old. I mean, I had my girlfriend, so that eventually we got married. But it was just, you're like, yeah, this whole thing of every, and by the way, the more senior you get, the more likely it is that you get called, and it's like, hey, we need someone to fill in a meeting in Paris. Can you make it tomorrow? And you're like, okay. So that was disruptive with my personal life. I know some people are able to manage both things, and I highly respect them for it. But in my case, it just became a little bit difficult. So at some point, I just said, this is enough for me. I was a junior partner when I decided that, and was associate principal, as McKinsey calls them. And I decided that it was time to move on. I think the other thing that was a trigger for me, and this is where Wharton also became important, was, as I said, I always have these kind of mental plans, which are a little bit weird, but I went to the 5-year reunion, and I was like, I'm still in step one, right? I'm still in step one of my 5-year plan. My 5-year plan was actually, leave Wharton, work for a couple of years at McKinsey, go work in pharma. And actually, I had a step 3, which I don't think it will materialize at this stage, but was like, and at some point, I'd like to go back to investment, so the venture capital or private equity in the healthcare space, because I said, this is, if I remember, one of the things that I actually learned from my startup was there are many things that I enjoyed. What I didn't enjoy was this sense of, we need to go get money all the time as an entrepreneur. So I said, wouldn't it be interesting to be on the other side where you can actually fund the companies and actually see them grow and be part of their growth journey, but not necessarily be the on the side that actually bears all the risk, or the personal risk, let's say. So that was my vision, and that's when, after 5 years, I was like, oh crap, I'm still in step 1 of this vision. How can I, course correct a little bit? And that's when I also and the personal life was also a big element, as I mentioned. So after that, I decided to leave and join Amgen. I actually joined Amgen. It's been 11 years now. Joined Amgen in Switzerland.
Tell us about how that transition happened from consulting to the industry.
So that, I have to say, that wasn't easy, right? What McKinsey is really good at is convincing you that McKinsey is the best thing that's ever going to happen to you. So it's like, we're the best company, we have the best people, we have the best talented people, we have the best opportunities, we have, so why would you ever leave if you can get to the next step, right? If you have an opportunity to partnership, if you have an opportunity to continue to have an impact. And there is this culture of, it's not unlike other industries. Like, I found something similar in banking where it's like really like, you're almost happy when you work weekends because you're like, this defines my worth. I'm working on weekends. This is awesome. And then you have a weekend to yourself and you're like, maybe I'm not doing things right at work or something, right? So it's this, they're very good at that. So when you're going to industry, it almost feels like, it's like, am I doing, it's going to sound horrible, but it's like, is it a step down? Because I'm leaving this awesome company that has convinced me for so many years that this is the best thing I'll do in my life. And, I don't know if a lot of consultants will say it in the way that I phrased it, but I have, in talking to consultants, they're like, well, how was the transition to industry? Like, it's always this big question. But, I think for me, ultimately, there's a couple of things that for me were important. I think one of them is, I was talking about passion and the sense of purpose. And when you work in a fast-paced company, you find purpose in the impact that you can have on companies. I think when you work in healthcare, you find purpose in the impact that the innovation that you bring can have on patients. And when things work out well, when companies are able to really create a culture that is focused on patients, I think it's hard to beat, right? And that's at least that's my that's my new purpose. So I did find purpose in what I do. I did find purpose in working in a company that believes in innovation and makes decisions around patients. And that made that transition worthwhile. And then when you couple that with the fact that I was able to balance that into a healthier work-life balance. It's funny, I quit McKinsey. So I was starting on July 5th at Amgen. I quit McKinsey, I guess, in early June, and I got married on June 19th or something, right? So it was all planned, right? It was like my life begins now. And again, yeah, I owe a ton of things to McKinsey and BCG in my years of management consulting, but it was a little bit like, it was a bigger change than just a new company. It was really a bunch of other things, as I said, finding purpose in a different way, and also, starting to have my life. I got married. My wife is from Belgium, so I got married, as I said, and just as I was leaving. Interestingly enough, when I left, she actually joined McKinsey. Um, so I didn't see a lot of her the first kind of year or so of our wedding, because she worked in Canada, she worked in Russia, she worked a little bit all over the place. Um, yeah, no, so we got married, and then a few years later, actually, we had our three kids. So I started with kids late in life. So I had my first kid almost with 40, and my twins when I was almost, I guess 41 when I had the twins. So it was uh, interesting to have almost triplets at that late in life, but
I really like how you say finding purpose. It sounded to me almost like you can find purpose wherever you are and you actively seek it out. Can you tell us about how you came about this mindset?
I mean, I think when I said the planning, it sounds a little bit goofy to say, I was an 18-year-old that was thinking 5 years ahead, or 10 years ahead. But I think that was my way of giving myself a purpose, right? I think, it's very odd what I'm going to say, but I think when I was in my early teens, I had a moment where I was like, I don't understand life. I don't understand what life is about. So, if you think about the couple of things that I shared with you, like, this thing about being the one that can tell the best stories, that was a little bit of a sense of purpose, right? It's like, I want to have interesting experiences. And I did, we talked a lot about work, but outside of work, I climbed mountains, jumped out of airplanes, did scuba diving in weird places, probably took risks that I shouldn't have. And that was all with that purpose of, I want to have an interesting life. Then it became a little bit about, I want to be, I want to go to an MBA. I want to have an interesting professional career where I can have an impact. So I think I've always been looking, because of this kind of void and really understanding why we're here, which again sounds a little bit philosophical for 7 a.m. on a Veterans Day, but it was really around trying to define that purpose, which I thought drove me to do better, to put more energy, to put more focus. And even as I was sharing that story about the startup, I think I realized that when people find purpose in what they do is when they're at their best, right? When they believe in what you're doing, when they understand the why, when it's not just kind of a 9 to or whatever hours you work, it's not just a day job that you have. You're doing something that's important. I think that's when people give their best. So it was multiple experiences and just this personal aspect of trying to create some sense of purpose, which I felt kind of energized me to do things and to look to improve myself.
So, Christian, how does that purpose guide you today? Like, what are you now, the next 5, 10 years? What is it guiding you towards down the line?
So I think if one of the things that I was saying when I joined Amgen and just the biopharmaceutical industry was really how attracted I was. I mean, I was attracted to Amgen for a couple of reasons. I think one of them was the fact that we, as I said, we have an impact on patient, and it's a company that when I talk to executives as I was interviewing and then just in my 11 years now in the company, is just seeing that people really do believe in that, right? And I remember even recently there was a weather issue. There was a big storm in the southern part of the U.S. and drugs couldn't make it to patients with leukemia, and it wasn't just a supply chain issue. Like suddenly the whole organization was aligned. There are two patients. It wasn't even like you could say, oh my God, this is a business thing. No, there were two patients that needed their medication, and everyone just kind of pencils down. Everyone was just focused on actually getting the medication to these patients. I've seen situations when I was in Argentina where people were fighting to say, hey, there's this particular individual that unfortunately, they can't get the medication. How can we help them find, funding or financing so that they can actually get the medication? I've even seen people say, I'm going to get money out of my pocket to actually see how we can actually help these individuals. So you really do see in the organization, and I'm sure it's similar in other pharma companies, but where people are really passionate about helping others, and everyone has their patient stories that they like to share. I have the privilege or to work in an area where there's where we can have a true impact on patient lives. I work in hematology. I've worked in oncology. Typically, we work in areas where there's large unmet need. So you can really see the impact that you can have when you hear the patients come back. Every now and then we try to have conversations with patients, or some patients are willing to tell their stories to create awareness. And I think that those again, when you hear their stories is when you really feel that sense of impact that you can have. But you were telling me a little bit about the future. So I think right now, if I think about my previous kind of thinking about venture capital, I think that is perhaps a little bit less appealing to me right now. I mean, we'll see, how the journey. I mean, I'm still energized and passionate about what I do, and what Amgen is doing for patients. We'll see how that continues in time, but I think there's still a lot to be done on this front, and they're still having a ton of fun with what I do. I'm now, I maybe just a little bit on what I've done at Amgen. So I started in Switzerland, spent a couple of years there. As it's not uncommon for someone coming from management consulting, I started in a sort of strategic role, working in what was at the time the international headquarter. Then I actually moved to Madrid, and spent actually 5 years in Spain, first in Madrid and then in Barcelona. That's where my kids were born, actually, in Madrid, and the twins in Barcelona. And roles of increasing responsibility on the commercial side, and then but it was I had another opportunity to be an entrepreneur. We were launching a drug in cardiovascular, so I had to build up our cardiovascular business there, which was, again, I found some of the same elements of people being super energized with a new launch, and that the drive to what we can achieve and how we can be better than the competition and all these other things that tend to energize competitive folks. And then after that, I came to the U.S. for a little bit. I was actually working in the intercontinental region. So I was basically in a regional role, covering Middle East, Africa, Americas, ex-US, Turkey, and it was really interesting. But anyway, so I did that for a little bit, and then I actually moved to Argentina. And again, one of the interesting things about Amgen is there was just so much to do when I joined. So we didn't have a presence in Argentina. So I actually started the affiliate in Argentina, which, again, another kind of entrepreneurial opportunity for me. So, went from basically not having a presence to having about 120 people in a couple of years, and building that presence. And again, super interesting. We had the opportunity, because it was a foreign company making investments in Argentina at the time. I had the opportunity to meet with the president. We had the opportunity to meet with a lot of different politicians that were actually very interested in understanding and attracting foreign investment at the time. So it was, again, just a really interesting time to bring people along, and we formed a really nice team over there, and And then about what was it? A little bit less, a year and a half ago, I actually moved to the U.S. and now heading our hematology business in the U.S., which was what I was alluding to. So anyway, yeah, tons of stuff to do still here, and yeah, still passionate about what I do.
How many countries have you lived in? Are you keeping a running tally? Lived in / worked in?
So that's an interesting one because, it's sometimes it comes down to definitions, right? So it's this weird thing about, when do you count? When do you live in a country, right? So I was telling you a little bit earlier, I spent a year in the UK, but I would go back every weekend. So I was living in a hotel. I remember the Sofitel near Piccadilly Circus. That's where I lived for most of that year. Is that living in the UK, given that I spent almost a year there? Or is the definition when you actually have an apartment? And then, I spent, I think, 8 to 10 weeks in Japan, and I actually had an apartment because they said, it's going to be much cheaper for you to rent an apartment than actually, live in a hotel. So anyway, if you're a kind of if you have a broad definition of living and spending, more than a couple of months and working there, it's probably, I think it's like 17, 18 countries that I've lived. Or so in Latin America, yeah, I've lived in Chile and Argentina and Brazil and Mexico, US. In Europe, I've, with that definition, I mean, with a non-disputable definition, I've lived in Spain, Belgium, France, and then with the more disputable one, you could say I've spent considerable amount of time in the UK, Germany, Italy. That I also in a bunch of other countries in Europe, and then in Asia, I lived in South Korea for sure because I spent 2.5 years there, living there. And then I spent some time in Japan. If you consider renting an apartment for a couple of months as living, that's that. But yeah, no. So it's been a bunch of different places. But it's it's interesting because there are a ton of benefits, but it also comes at a cost, right? So it's that part where sometimes people ask me, hey, where do you feel you're from? And I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I'm from, home is where my family is right now. So. But it was interesting when I went back to Argentina. I would tell my wife, "Hey, don't worry, I have a ton of friends here, right? So it's going to be fine." And then we arrived, and I remember myself calling all my friends, and some of them were just like, "We haven't seen you in 18 years. Like, what's the hurry of getting together, right?" So yeah, no, lived in a bunch of different places with different things there.
How does that multicultural experience manifest in your leadership style? How would you describe yourself as a leader?
That's a really interesting question. I think one thing that it does is one thing that you learn when you start to move around so much and when you live in different cultures is perhaps the need to pause and listen more before you kind of make a conclusion, right? Because when you walk into a different cultural context and with your frame of reference, it's very simple to very quickly say what you're doing is wrong. That you didn't, it's there was a funny phrase that I read somewhere which said, it's something like I'm not going to say it correctly, but it was something like, even the bad guys in their mind think that they're the good guys or something like that, right? So everyone is trying to do the best they can, except for some folks. But so at the end of the day, it's having that perspective to say, let's listen why you're making the decision that you're making. Let's understand the context that you're coming out of. And I think that has translated in this kind of trying to empower people, trying to listen, leveraging expertise, because at the end of the day, the other thing that happens when you move around so much is, I'm not going to be the expert in a particular market. I'm not going to be the one that has all the relationships, or at least until now, that's a little bit of what I've accepted, right? You move so much, you can never be the one that knows all the key customers or knows all the key market dynamics or knows the specificity about things. So that makes you a little bit more reliant on saying, I want to bring in, a really good team, make sure that they're empowered to do what they need to do, give them the tools so that they can be successful. And then, my role is, hopefully help overcome barriers, provide a different perspective, and then obviously as I start to learn about the business and obviously, understand that better every time I kind of move to a new place, it is really obviously to provide, to try to build on what is already there. But it's that initial kind of maybe pause and reflection, empowering, looking for people that can bring the expertise, thinking about teams that can, complement each other, because that becomes so important when you have the sort of skill set that I have, which is different to what sometimes the traditional people that always work in the same market have. So, I think those are some of the key elements that change.
And the same question about fatherhood. How having this nomadic.
I think from a parent perspective, it's interesting. I mean, it's a little bit challenging sometimes because as a parent, you don't know what. I'm just trying to find the right word here, but you don't know to what extent what your decisions are having as an impact on your children. So, I think I was very quick to say, hey, I kind of switch countries all the time. It's probably going to be fine for my kids as well. But then you realize that, they're losing out on certain things that are not, for whatever reason, you kind of gave up on, but you think it's an important part of the life journey, right? So I moved so much that, I've been okay with the fact that I don't have these long friendships. Now internet and so forth has made it easier, but growing up, it was really hard to keep up with friends once you moved. But now, it really breaks your heart. The other day I was with my 6-year-old, and he was telling me how excited he was because he had a little friend that he had known for a year. And it was like, you're like, oh my God, what am I doing? I'm destroying my children. So I think from a personal perspective, what that brings you, I mean, the traveling, just, you're constantly challenging yourself in terms of, is it time to kind of put the whatever the equivalent of the soccer boots, to rest, or leaving the mileage cards to rest because you're like, maybe we should look for a little bit of stability for the family. So that's one thing that I think is important.
Cristian, something that we make sure we ask all of our guests, tying it all back to Wharton, is please complete this sentence. Wharton is a place where blank.
It's interesting because Elena obviously sent me the question beforehand, and it was hard for me because it's a place where there's so many different things. I allowed myself to rephrase the question and say, what in one word, what does Wharton mean? And for me, it's just opportunity. If I think about Wharton, it's it's been an opportunity to change the direction of my career in the sense that I was working in Latin America, and I really think that without Wharton, it would have been harder for me to actually do that transition to working in Europe. I think the Lauder program was instrumental in helping me build the right narrative to actually make that work a lot easier than it would have been otherwise. I think it was also great to meet just super interesting people. I think in other parts of the world, you typically end up with people that are very similar to you. I think Wharton, and this is, I'm sure a lot of other top MBAs in the US have this, you meet the elite sports person and the kind of the special forces guy from the military, and just people that were extremely successful in their field, whatever that might have been. And that also teaches you a lot about resilience and drive and passion. And that was something that I also took away. And I think the other thing is even the time that you spend there, it's just such a unique couple of years. It's I was again in this kind of like, I want to be the one that has all the interesting stories. I did volunteer work in Cameroon. I did volunteer work in India. I was part of the crew. I had never rowed before, but I was there rowing every morning, a couple times a week at 6 o'clock in the morning. I worked for a biotech incubator. I worked with angel investors in Mexico. I did a bunch of different things aside from obviously the Europa and Wallasa stuff that we used to do for fun. But it was just such an intense couple of years where you just get so much out of it, and build these long standing friendships, and just it's an opportunity to to meet interesting people, to have a change the career path, and it just a great place. So I'm looking forward to I'm feeling really old when I'm going to say this, but the 20-year reunion that's coming up in I guess 3 years now, but that's the next big one coming up for us.
Thank you. That gave me goosebumps listening to you.
But no, it was great. And thanks, guys. Again, as I said, this was a really interesting conversation. It was great to connect. It was great to just kind of go back and think about things, and share with you guys. So thanks for taking the time to have this conversation with me.
Thank you again for joining us.
Cristian, thank you so much for sharing the story. It was so cool to hear about all different parts of the world. It was a great way for me to start my day. I'm feeling invigorated.
Same here. Thank you very much. And thanks everybody for watching, and see you in the next episode.